need very many calories. For example, they've put women in closed wards where they could absolutely control the amount of food they ate and found that lots of fat women are burning only 700. They can even gain weight on 700 calories a day, where the textbooks used to say that everyone has to lose weight if they eat less than 1,700 calories a day. Many women, even this was about 30 years ago that they did the tests, they found that many overweight women were burning probably about 35% as much fuel as they should at a normal metabolic rate. That means that if you do anything to poison your thyroid function, that you won't need as many calories and you also won't need as many vitamins and minerals to prevent specific deficiencies. And polyunsaturated fats happen to be very general and effective blockers of thyroid function. A whole series of papers was published in French Annals of Endocrinology showing that the secretion of the thyroid gland is inhibited by the polyunsaturated fats. The ability of transport proteins in the blood to carry thyroid hormone was blocked by these same unsaturated fats. And the more unsaturated, the more perfect the blocking. So that if they had 3 or 4 double bonds, they almost completely blocked the ability of the protein to carry thyroid. And also at the various levels inside the cell, if the cell managed to receive some thyroid hormone, the polyunsaturated fats would block the ability of the cell to respond to it. So at every conceivable level of thyroid function, polyunsaturated fats are lowering the ability of the thyroid to maintain normal respiratory rate, thus leading to all the consequences of increasing estrogen, decreasing progesterone, accumulating fat, and the fat cells become a major factory for making more estrogen. All of the degenerative processes increase as the oxidative metabolism decreases. Production of free radicals from the unsaturated fat increases when good energy isn't being produced.
Why do you think it is that the orthomolecular specialists and much of the industry is touting flaxseed oil and fish oils as brain food then? What's the misfire here?
Oh, well, if you grind up someone's brain, you find that it's full of chicken fat and fish oil-like stuff. It reflects exactly what we've been eating. So if you feed pigs a good diet of cheese and apples and whey and so on, their fats will be pretty much like butter fat. Cows can eat a lot of unsaturated fats because they have a rumen that detoxifies it. And so a calf's brain, when it's born, all of its tissues are deficient, so-called, in the essential fatty acids because the rumen is destroying the essential fatty acids before they get to the tissues. But animals like pigs and chickens and fish, everyone who doesn't have a rumen, their tissues will reflect pretty much exactly the composition of the fats in what they eat. So it turns out that the brain, being composed more of fat than of any other substance, it will have a very high concentration of these unsaturated fats that the person has been eating.
But why do they call it brain food? I don't mean lodged in the brain, but why do they call it like it's really good for your brain? Why?
Well, a group in France that believes that just about 3 years ago, I think it was, decided to put electrodes on pregnant women to measure the fetus's response to various sounds that they could detect. And so they found that they could train the baby before it was born to respond to different sounds. And so they said, we'll demonstrate that DHA and EPA are brain food improving the quality of the brain by doing measurements of the ability to learn of the fetus. And they found exactly what they hadn't expected, that the brain learning response was retarded in proportion to the mother's consumption of the fish fat type of highly unsaturated fats. And after the babies were born, in fact, they were underdeveloped, including the brain, which was exactly what animal experimenters had demonstrated way back in the 1970s, that when pregnant mice were put on a diet of either highly unsaturated vegetable oil or saturated fat, with mice they could grind up their brains and weigh them and so on. And the babies that were exposed to the high prenatal diet of unsaturated fats had smaller brains, and they didn't learn as well as the babies that had been exposed to saturated fats. So both in the recent studies in humans and the old studies in animals show that the polyunsaturated fats retard brain development both in function and in actual size. Studies back in the 1960s and 70s also showed that sugar and progesterone are factors that increase brain growth, development, and learning ability.
Did you say sugar and progesterone?
Yeah, for example, Zamenhof was the person who found that a chicken's brain, the embryo's brain, grew rapidly as long as there was still glucose present inside the egg. And he found that the brain stopped growing as soon as the supply of glucose in the egg ran out, even though there was still a lot of energy food, the polyunsaturated fat or saturated fat, there was still enough for the body to keep growing, but the brain stopped when the glucose ran out. So at that number of days of development, he would open the eggshell and inject a little bit of glucose or other food that was equivalent to glucose, and showed that it didn't affect the body size very much because all chickens had enough fat in the egg for their body to grow, but the brains kept growing because of the added glucose to the egg. And the chickens were born with uniquely large brains for a chicken, and they were smarter than ordinary chickens.
How do we process what you just said? Because it can be confusing for us.
Obstetricians, as recently as old people that I knew, old doctors in the 1970s, were still aware of the fact that their so-called diabetic mothers very often had extremely precocious babies. I talked to one woman who was told to go on a reducing diet because her previous pregnancy she had very high blood sugar. And I asked her how that baby had turned out. She said, he taught himself to read when he was 2 years old. And she said when he was 4, he was already wearing adult hat sizes, which is basically an extension of what Zamenhof demonstrated with chicken embryo development. Sugar is the limiting factor usually in brain development. But in the 1970s, doctors were looking for new diseases to treat, and diabetes was extended to include the very completely new concept of gestational diabetes. And where 130 blood sugar had been considered very healthy for a pregnant woman, they now wanted to restrain the level of blood sugar during pregnancy, and they started calling it a disease, gestational diabetes, that really it was just a healthy pregnancy in most cases.
So what is your take about, I'm trying to get to, I guess, your final take on flaxseed oil and DHA, which is that these, quote, essential fatty acids are not necessary and are not useful. Is that what you're saying?
I've been asking people for, I guess, about 40 years now for what the evidence is for the essentiality of any of these fats. And those very odd few studies